bringing you key insights, tips, and advice from the brightest minds in the Canadian franchise industry. This is the Franchise Canada Chats podcast. I'm Travis Tinning.
And I'm Patrick Wyness with Franchise Growth Lab.
Your guest hosts for Season 6 of the Franchise Canada Chats podcast, where we take you into the world of franchising. Our interviews are with franchisees, franchisors, and industry leaders who give you on-point expert advice and share their franchising insights and experiences.
We all know how important and unique the franchisee-franchisor relationship is. So for today's bonus episode of Franchise Canada Chats, we brought together Frank Zaid of Frank Zaid Franchise Legal Support Services, Brian Leon, CEO of Choice Hotels Canada, and myself, Patrick Wyness, VP of Operations for Franchise Growth Lab. So Travis, some pretty amazing guests here.
Well, two amazing guests plus you. No, I'm joking, Patrick. No, folks, we have three people on this call with Frank, Brian, and Patrick who, together have about 75, maybe 80 years of franchising experience. And they are all very, very passionate about maintaining the franchisee-franchisor relationship. In today's interview, we actually dive deep into franchise advisory councils. What are they? How to form them effectively, and how to use them to continually maintain the franchisee-franchisor relationship and strengthen your brand.
Absolutely. So all about communications. So enjoy this member-only bonus episode.
Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Franchise Canada Chats podcast. Today, our guests are going to be speaking about how franchise systems get great results from establishing franchisor advisory boards, or FABs, and franchisee advisory councils, or FACs. Sorry about that. Let's dive right in. We got a great panel, a great experienced panel of people who have a lot of experience in this. I'd like to introduce you to, and guys, if you can just give a quick wave and then we'll go around the horn for an introduction. But I'd like to introduce you to Brian Leon, CEO of Choice Hotels, Frank Zaid of Fran Legal Support Services, and Patrick Wyness of Franchise Growth Lab. Brian, why don't we start with you real quick? Why don't you just give a very fast introduction to yourself and what your experience is with FACs and franchise advisory boards?
Sure. Well, thank you, Travis, and great to be here with you and with Patrick and with Frank. So, but very pleased to be talking about this topic. It's one that has some particular significance for our company. So, a little bit of a background on our company, Choice Canada. We have over 330 hotels across Canada. We're 100% franchised by hotel count. We're the largest hotel franchisor in Canada and part of Choice Hotels International, which has over 7,000 hotels globally, one of the largest global hotel chains. So I've been with Choice for about 15 years. Prior to that, worked in franchise food service companies and spent a number of years in the board of directors of the Canadian Franchise Association. So very familiar with the CFA as well. And a little bit of trivia that I'll start with. It relates specifically to our topic today. I first met Frank Zaid back in, you'll remember this, Frank, 1983, when I was a student in the business school at Western University. And Frank was still is a very young lawyer, but a young lawyer specializing, one of the few specializing in franchise law. And I was doing a research paper on, of all things, franchise associations. And Frank was a huge help with my paper. And here we are 37 or 38 years later, or whatever it is, talking about the same thing. So, and I'm a big believer in the value that effective, franchisee associations or franchisee advisory councils can play in franchise systems like ours. So happy to offer some comments about it in the context of our company in the important role that it plays.
Perfect. Yeah, that's and I mean, I know you, the three of us anyway have had multiple conversations on this topic, and I every time that I speak to you guys on this, I learn a lot. And Patrick, I think they got us beat. We've only known each other for 15 years, so they win there. But Patrick, why don't you just give a quick background for the audience and your experience with franchise advisory councils?
Absolutely. Thanks, Travis. And thanks to the rest of the panel for being here. My background, so I've spent the last 20 years in franchising, two bigger Canadian systems, so both with 1-800-GOT-JUNK and Nurse Next Door, mostly on the operations team, but also had a stint as a franchise partner with 1-800-GOT-JUNK as well. And the big topic today, the Franchisor Advisory Board and the Franchisee Advisory Council. On the council side, I've had a lot of experience from the franchisor point of view, being a co-chair and being part of all of the meetings. And over the last 2 years with the Franchise Growth Lab, been working with a lot of emerging brands in getting franchise advisory councils set up. So talking about, the timing and the structure and making sure that they're effectively used. So a little bit of experience there, and happy to share what I've learned.
Excellent. And actually, Patrick and I have sat on the same councils. And again, I can say from a franchisee franchisor relationship perspective, is there really isn't more of an important framework than maybe establishing this when you get to a certain part in your brand. Now, Frank, over to you. Quick a quick background on and your experience, and then don't go too far, and take a quick sip of water, because I'm actually going to come right back to you after you do your intro with to help me set the framework for this.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this program. It's something that I have a considerable experience in, and always motivated to try to get the message out to franchisors and franchisees about the importance of FABs and FACs. I think a lot of people know that I have been in franchising for over 45 years. I'm probably the longest standing member of the CFA, but I still feel quite young and like to give back to the community. I started out as a young lawyer with a major law firm in Canada and got into franchising by accident because of two companies that were referred to us from the United States, and nobody knew anything about franchising other than they thought it was hockey teams and gas distribution companies. So through that experience, I got to be very interested in dealing with entrepreneurs who started franchise companies. And I spent 40 years in law practice. Was one of 3 lawyers at the time in the country doing franchising, and developed a very vibrant practice in the firm. I retired about 10 years ago. In my practice, I had worked with 400 plus franchise systems. And even though lawyers don't get involved very much in business, but with that kind of experience, I really got to know a lot about franchise operations. And near the end of when I was retiring, I got trained as a mediator and arbitrator. And I've been doing that for over 10 years, mediating and arbitrating franchise disputes. I've also appeared as an expert witness in franchise disputes on a number of occasions. But the thing that I really do enjoy the most is serving on franchisor advisory boards. I don't serve on any franchisee councils, but I have been involved with Brian for 25. Before Brian came to Choice, I got involved in the board of directors of Choice Hotels 25 years plus ago when it was formed. And that is an advisory board to the company and to management. It's as we say, an FAB. I've also been on several other prominent franchise advisory boards, and always am looking for opportunities to continue to do that. And as part of my law practice and just general information, I have seen and been involved in franchise advisory councils, and I've seen probably and read about the best and the worst of how they can operate. So I'm delighted to be able to share some of my experience with the people tuning in, and always learn from the other panelists.
Great. And yeah, like I said, take a quick sip of water here, because I'm gonna come right back to you. But I now have with you being the one of the longest serving members at 40 some odd years or have 45 years in franchising. My own trivia nugget for people is Frank actually joined the CFA at 7 years old. So no, in all seriousness, again, to the franchisors that are listening to this, I don't want to date us all here, but just by my basic math, there is darn near between 80 and 90 years of franchising experience on this call. And, and Frank talked about, being an expert witness in different franchisor disputes. One of the points of this podcast or of this episode itself is, we want to help you avoid any of those disputes. But okay, Frank, real quick, back to you. In order to just set the framework for our discussion today, there is a little bit of confusion in the franchise community about the different councils, boards, associations, etc., with franchisors and franchisees. In a quick synopsis, can you define each of these in sort of their terms and what your experience, the names, what their function is, and then we'll dive into really what we're going to be focusing on today.
Sure, there is a great deal of confusion because they're not legal terms, they're business terms, and different companies give these entities different names. And there's a lot of confusion, and I get confused all the time. And I know all four of us have different names that we associate with the entities. I think the easiest way to try to separate what we're talking about is to talk about entities that are of service to the franchisor only, entities that are of service to franchisees with franchisor participation. And then the third one, I'll say entities that only service franchisees. I'll just mention what that is, but that's not something we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about the entities that service the franchisor, the common terms are franchisor advisory boards or boards of directors. As Brian mentioned, I've been involved with Choice, or I should mention, for 25 years, but they have a formal board of directors in the legal sense, which is unique to that organization. But most franchisors that establish advisory boards do it as a matter of contract. They select different people of different backgrounds that can advise the franchisor on a going forward basis. Could be lawyers, could be accountants, could be people like Patrick, who have had experience with other franchisors. The key thing, though, is that the composition of those advisory boards should not be your best friends unless they have the experience that you need. They should be people who are seasoned in franchising from different disciplines and can act as true advisors to the franchisor. On the franchisor side, we're talking about franchisee advisory councils or franchisee advisory boards, and that's usually composed of different members of the franchise community or the franchise system. We'll get into the discussion later about how we do this, but the key thing is that that's an entity or a creature that is there to service and listen to and have good relations with the franchisees, and there may be a representative or two from the franchisor on that entity. And then the last one, which we're not going to talk about, but which always gets a lot of prominence in the news, are franchisee associations. And these are associations formed by franchisees for either a single purpose or for a collective purpose. And they are often creatures of dissatisfied franchisees who feel they're not getting the relationship that they want or getting the franchisor to pay attention to them. And it's often a precursor to a big lawsuit. So I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah, you know what, it does. And I think, really, if I can just sum that up quickly, where for the purposes of today's discussion, we're really going to talk more about FACs, or the group that, involves franchisees from your system, as well as maybe a couple of members of the franchisor as more of a liaison and a communication tactic. We're going to touch a little bit on franchise advisory boards, helping young and emerging franchise brands, establish a network of professionals that can help them grow their systems, really with the whole point of avoiding those franchisee associations, I think is what the ultimate goal is. So let's jump right into FACs, or franchise advisory councils, right now. And Brian and Patrick, I'm gonna come to you first, but Brian, maybe just talk to me. You guys have a very successful franchise advisory council. Maybe just talk to me about the importance of a strong franchise advisory council and what the components are of that.
Sure, no, happy to. And you're right. I mean, for us, it's a real integral part of our system. And I think that, what I often say when I'm talking to other franchisors, if you believe as a franchisor that there's a lot that you can learn from your franchisees, then having an effective franchisee advisory council it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to harness that strength. And that's really what we try to do, within our system. So we have something that we call our Choice Canada Franchise Advisory Board. That's what we call it. But for the purposes of our discussion today, it is that type of an advisory council. It's not a council that has specific decision-making authority on anything, but that doesn't in any way take away from the critical responsibility value that it provides to our system. So the way it works within our system is it's a group of between 10 and 15 franchisee members. These are all either principals of our franchisee entities, or in some cases general managers of our hotels. And we have participation, not membership, but participation by our key management at our CCFAB meetings. And I'm at every meeting. Our CFOs at every meeting. Our heads of our franchise services department, our commercial departments are all there. We view it, as I said, as a great opportunity to be able to get that engagement and that advice, from our franchisees. And I could talk in a lot of detail about that. And if we have some time, maybe talk about our experience specifically as it relates to the pandemic, because there was never a time in the history of our company where this was more valuable for us than over the last couple of years, where we were all dealing with charting these unprecedented waters, and without our franchise advisory board, it just would have been so much more difficult for us. So I'm extraordinarily grateful to the members of our advisory board for the guidance that they give us on an ongoing basis.
You know what, that's an excellent point, in the sense that, I mean, we just went through, probably one of the worst crises from a business perspective that any of us have in our lifetime. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be low points or more crises coming up, and so having an effective franchise advisory council formed, really helps. It's just another element of support for franchise partners. Now, Patrick, I'm going to come to you. I'm just going to set Frank up for a question that's going to come after. Frank, I'm going to get Patrick to just talk about, some successful examples and maybe some unsuccessful examples of how franchise advisory councils are run. And then obviously the next question that's going to come to you, Frank, is going to be around, okay, great. You've talked about what they are. Now, how do we form them? But first, Patrick, like you, in your experience, you've been a part of and seen some effective franchise advisory councils and some not so effective. Why don't you talk about the elements of each?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of it comes down to setting the groundwork of what the FAC is and what it isn't. Brian, you mentioned a little bit earlier that it's not a decision-making board. When you have an FAC, and I'll just speak to some generalities here, but what is it not? It's not a decision-making board. We're not expecting this group to necessarily solve all the problems. This is not a group that votes or approves necessarily anything. And we have to set that groundwork that you're not joining this board to solve your location's problems. Now, what is it? What is it? You set the guidelines that it's a sounding board for the franchisor. Here's where the franchisor and the franchisee can bounce ideas off each other. It's for sharing ideas from a system perspective and provide feedback, opinions, suggestions, looking for help in leading new initiatives. And something you have to keep in mind, it's designed for the best interest of the brand. And so really making sure every system is going to have its own guidelines, but really making sure that these guidelines are laid out ahead of time. We see this a lot with emerging brands, that sometimes franchise partners are excited to join this because they feel, well, I'm going to get in here and I'm going to change everything. I'm going to have a say. It's like I'm on strata now. So, really establishing those guidelines early is really, really important. And your question, when do they work well and when do they have challenges? Well, they work well when the franchise system feels that they have input, they have a say, they feel listened to.
They're contributing.
Right? They're contributing. They feel like they're able to contribute. When they don't work well is when you have, this quarterly meeting, or however often you have this meeting, you get all the franchise partners in and they're just sit there and presented to. They don't have any input. They don't feel they have any say. And now it's like, okay, now go back and talk to the rest of the system and tell them what we told you. That's not in an effective way to run.
Right. Interesting. So I guess what I heard out about that is you're leveraging, the whole point of an FAC is leveraging that village of knowledge that is your franchisee community and showing that you're listening. It's when you when you're not taking that input, or you're just trying to use the FAC as just a communication vehicle to push down new systems or something like that, where it can fall apart. That's a really good point. Frank, I mean, we've now talked about what an FAC is and talked a little bit about Brian and Patrick's experience there, but obviously there's many ways in which FACs are formed and how they operate. Why they might be a great asset to the franchisor. But why don't we talk about just really sort of the guidelines or what you've seen, best practices on how you actually form an effective FAC?
Sure. Just as an intro to answering that question, I want to remind everybody, we're all members of the CFA, and we're all very positive and supportive of the CFA and have been for many years. As members of the CFA, our respective companies and all the members of the CFA are bound to observe the CFA Code of Ethics. And I'm just going to read you one sentence from paragraph 10 of the CFA Code of Ethics. A franchisor should encourage open dialogue with franchisees through franchise advisory councils or other communication mechanisms. We don't need to go any further. Those are simple words. The Code of Ethics is encourage open dialogue with franchisees through franchise advisory councils or other communication mechanisms. There's one word in there that's already been tossed around a bit, Travis. Communication. That's what this is about. It's about communicating openly and fairly with your franchisees. And there's one other quote I want to read, because this is a topic that is outside of just our own experience. This is a quote from a person who wrote an article called "The Value of Establishing a Franchise Advisory Council." It was in Forbes magazine, a Forbes website in 2019. Ultimately, franchisees just want to be heard. Creating an established channel for communication or concerns or ideas, or making sure franchisees are staying profitable, are essential to a strong franchisor-franchisee relationship. Franchise advisory councils can make all the difference in working towards that goal. I've never heard it expressed better than that. In keeping in mind the purpose is for open communications and open dialogue and establishing positive relations, there are a couple of things that I have seen that go towards making sure that a franchise advisory council works well for both sides. Number one, and Brian has already mentioned this, number one, you have to have buy-in from the most senior management of the franchisor. And that means, for the sake of communicating and being involved in the operations of an advisory council, that senior management or a very senior person has to have the responsibility of seeing this kind of entity work and show by participation that there is franchisor buy-in. I was involved once with a very well-established, well-known franchisor that had a form of advisory council, and there was a permanent member of management whose job was to be the person liaising with the council and attending the meetings. The only problem was that person reported to the CEO. Virtually anything that was brought up at a meeting that might have been a positive situation for franchisees could be vetoed by the CEO, and did get vetoed. That's not the way to go. So the advisory councils have to be set up to have proper representation to the franchisee community. Now, you could have a situation like Brian's where you have close to 350 franchisees, or you could have a startup or an emerging franchisor with 10 units. But either way, you've got to make sure that there's independent representation, maybe on a regional basis if you're a large franchisor, or on a smaller basis, and that the people who are selected to be on the advisory council are either in the early stages may be selected by the franchisor, but as the system grows larger, the regions should be given the right to elect their representatives. And that may be that you're going to get some representatives who you think are troublemakers. You can't veto the voice of the voters. And in fact, I've seen situations where people labeled as troublemakers become great assets because they're troublemakers, often because they're not heard. In terms of, just a couple of things, I think you want to have a selection process. You want to have bylaws or composition or how you're going to operate the advisory council. When are meetings going to be held? Every meeting should be a proper meeting. They're not social gatherings. You may have a social gathering before or after, but you have to have agenda and you have to allocate time to the different topics, and you have to seek input from your franchisees before the meetings on what they would like to discuss. There'll be things that will be brought up on a regular basis as part of the agenda. Decision making we've talked about. No, they don't make decisions. They may make a strong suggestion or recommendation that you have to take back and consider with management, but they don't have decision-making authority. And communications is another area where I think is really, really important, that there are minutes of the meetings drawn up and that they are distributed to the members of the advisory board to take a look at. But ultimately, unless there are confidential matters that are discussed there that would not be appropriately raised with everybody, those minutes have to be circulated, and every franchisee should know what is being discussed and what matters are moving forward. It sounds complicated, but if you think about trust, relationship, openness, and communications, it'll work well. The last thing, of course, there is an expense in having this, and the franchisor has to bear the expense of the travel costs for the franchisee delegates and understand that they are making some sacrifices from their own businesses and taking the time off to do this.
Right. And we're going to, I do want to, when you said it sounds complicated, we are going to, lean on Brian and Patrick here to demystify it a little bit and maybe take the fear out of it for some people as far as, a lot of work. But I do want to, I want to touch on something you said there, Frank, you brought up relationships so many times. And I think we all have to understand that the franchisee-franchisor relationship is one of the most unique relationships in a business environment that is out there. It's not a parent-child relationship. It's not an employee-employer relationship. It is a very interdependent relationship that only or when functioning at maximum capacity, magic happens. And our goal as franchisors, and I would put some of this on franchisees as well. Our goal is to work incredibly hard on maintaining that positive franchisee-franchisor relationship. And again, FACs are a great way to do that. So on that note, Frank just touched on some logistics. Brian, I'm going to come to you in a second to talk about, when you're a larger operation on how you elect your members. But Patrick, going back to something that Frank said, for some of the emerging brands listening, what would be the most sort of, or in your experience, the most effective way to kind of form that board, when voting, might be challenging because you don't have a lot of partners.
Yeah. Well, to step back even further, for a lot of emerging brands, a common question I get is when is it time? When is it time to start forming, a franchise advisory council? And although it's different for every brand, we've touched on it many times. It's around communication. And in the early days, when you've got 5, 10, even 15 locations, The communication is always very open. Usually the founder, the CEO, the director of operations, they're on speed dial. Everything's fine. But as you start adding more and more partners, that's not scalable anymore.
Right.
And, in my experience, once you're getting to that sort of 20 to 25 partner mark, the communication starts to become too thin. And we always want to keep that outlet. So that's typically around the time where I would suggest starting to think about putting this council together.
Sorry, let me just stop you there real quick. When you are between, say, let's just say when you're over 10 or let's say 15 to 25, what would be an appropriate size of an FAC?
Yeah, that's another good question. It's typically between 3 and 5 partners, depending on size. The other thing to think about is someone mentioned geography. If you've got 20 locations that are spanning a very large geography, you may need more representation from different areas. If you're all in one province or one state, it may need a smaller council. So it is very system dependent there. But you don't want to start too small. You don't want half of your system on your Franchise Advisory Council. It defeats the purpose. So once established, now your original question is, how do you start to select members? And in the early stages, this can be really tough. We've talked about the relationship. If we go back to Greg Nathan's 6 stages, the E factor, right? In the early stages, you don't want a whole bunch of people on the council other than the glee stage, because they're not really seeing the full picture yet. And you don't want a whole bunch of people on the council that are down in the bottom in that, me and fee stage, because they're not coming, again, they're not coming in with an open mind. So, some of the parameters that I look at in the early stages are, who are the partners that have sort of gone past that ditch, and they're in more of the C and the we stage. They realize that there's a benefit of working together. They may not be, they could still be the troublemakers, Frank. That's, I'm not saying we get rid of the troublemakers, but we get the troublemakers that are realizing that they're here for the bigger brand, the bigger system, not just their own agenda. So we take a look at that, and we also take a look at who are the people that are open to listening, who are the most coachable partners we have in the system. Again, people that are willing to listen to the other perspectives and take that into consideration. So that's what we're looking at. And Brian, you said it earlier. The other key is having that key person in operations that could potentially even co-chair in the early days. So you'd want, I typically see a co-chair situation where you have, one half from the franchisee system and one half from the franchisor in the operations. And those two together are really put in charge of building out the agenda well in advance, getting it out to the rest of the FAC, get their input on the agenda. So it's very well thought out before we even come to the meeting.
Right. Excellent. And I do actually want to get back to the troublemaker and the coachability perspective and the objectivity, just because a franchisor may feel that someone, and Frank touched on this, but sometimes people, franchisors feel a franchisee is a pain in the ass. And really what Frank said is they just want to be heard. They just want to be listened. And I've sat on, a franchise advisory council as a franchisee, for in various periods of time, but probably combined for a dozen years. And I've seen troublemakers become, to Frank's point, become some of the biggest advocates for the system, for a couple of reasons. Number one is, again, all of a sudden they feel heard and their attitude, does a complete 180. The other thing too is they develop that sense of objectivity, and they are now able to see things through a couple of lenses, not just the franchisee's lenses. They're able to see it through the franchisor's lenses as well. So, on that note, Patrick just talked about sort of, emerging brands. Brian, going, to a larger brand, how do you guys, elect your members, and what's the structure? This is a 3-parter. What's the structure of your meetings, and who sets the agenda?
Sure. Yeah, no, great questions. This is really interesting because it's, clearly the whole conversation about, you call sort of the troublemakers. I always love that because it's, we look on our CCFAB. First of all, it's done by election, so we're not appointing people directly, but we look to get some of our most vocal critics within our franchise community to be on our board, because they tend to be they're vocal and they're going to speak up in the meetings, and that's how we're going to have good productive meetings. Now, what we look for on our membership is to have really good franchisees, in the sense that they're doing a great job of running their businesses. So maybe they drive our team a little bit crazy from time to time, and maybe they're a little bit more vocal than we'd like on some days. But if they are doing a great job of running their business, then we know there's stuff that we can learn from them. So that kind of informs our position on who we get into them. Just in terms of the structure of our board, we do have formal bylaws for our board. We have between 10 and 15 members, all franchisee, principals or GMs of our hotels. We've got an election process, 2-year term for our members. They can, renew those terms. We can renew those terms, based on agreement of our nominating committee, which is our franchisees, for an additional 2-year period. And we have some executive roles on that. Members, they've got to be in good standing. There's no compensation aside from expense reimbursement. And we ensure that they all sign a non-disclosure, because we share a lot of very sensitive information with our franchise advisory board. We talked a little bit earlier about this whole theme of them not getting to make decisions and vote on things. And that is absolutely the case. It's our philosophy on it, but that is said in no way a negative and to take away from the importance of their role. What I would say is it's actually the exact opposite. One of the things that I have seen, where I've seen some franchisee advisory councils kind of go wrong, is that they look at it as an opportunity to get the franchisees through their board or their council to kind of rubber stamp decisions that are made by, or programs that are made by the franchisor. And it becomes something that almost can be a negative from the standpoint of the rest of the system, where they view, they kind of say, well, do we really want these people on this board making decisions on our behalf? So we intentionally don't do it that way. And we're, very intentional about that, to say that, what we're looking for is great feedback that will help us make decisions. We think it is critically important that we make sure that the time that our franchisees are spending at our meetings and engaged in our process, that it's valuable time for them, that they get something out of it. We don't want them coming, having a nice meal, showing up, listening to a bunch of presentations, nodding their heads and leaving, and not really getting anything out of it, other than maybe to provide us little bits of feedback. Now, what I will say is that actually used to be the way it was in our franchise advisory council. It used to be like that, and we really turned it upside down. And we did that. This probably goes back 7 or 8 years ago, where we recognized that we weren't getting the value out of it, that everybody was kind of going through the motions, and we were falling into that trap that, we didn't want to fall into, where we were just having people show up for meetings, we're presenting to them, maybe getting bits and pieces of feedback, but not really getting the value for us or for them out of the time. And we ended up doing a 2 or 3 day strategy session with our franchise advisory board, where we just turned everything upside down. And out of that came this whole new structure for our board. Again, we call it a board, not a council, that has been just tremendously valuable for us. And, where we have within our franchise advisory council subgroups that work on very specific initiatives that our franchisees think are really important. So, right now, for example, we have a working group working on issues relating to labor and all of the challenges around labor. We've got another subgroup of some of our members working on issues, relating to training and providing good education to the frontline staff that we have across the country. And it's really helped to make sure that we and they and our franchise community get great value out of it. And just to go back to your other point about in terms of the management of it, what we find is that even though the council is something that is an entity of our franchisees, we have to be ready to step up and provide the administrative support to that, or it just won't work right. I think that, so the way we've got it set up is one of our sort of senior team is appointed as the direct liaison on behalf of head office to the Franchise Advisory Council, just to provide the guidance and the support that we need to make sure that we have great agendas that are coming out, that the agendas are covering what the franchisees want to talk about, what we need to talk about, and that we're not putting too much of an administrative burden on them so that when they come to the meetings, they have to come prepared. We give them, information and information packages in advance of the meetings. But when they come, they are ready to have a good, engaged debate discussion.
You know what? That's a really excellent point, and I'm very glad you brought that up. I mean, you want your franchisees to be running and growing their businesses. You don't want to saddle them with a bunch of administrative work that goes along with the actual Franchise Advisory Council. And guys, we're running out of time here, and it's teaching me that we could probably do another session on franchise advisory boards as well as a franchise advisory council. And I'm picking and choosing carefully here, Frank, of what I wanted to ask you. And I think we're gonna skip the discussion on a franchise advisory board right now and stick to the relationship building piece of franchise advisory councils and why it's so important. Why can you talk to us a little bit about what can go wrong if you're not effectively communicating with your franchisees, if you don't you don't have an effective franchise advisory council? Can you share some examples of where that can go south?
Well, again, it gets to communications. And when in business, if there's a failure to communicate, then rumors start. And rumors start in franchising all the time. Let's not kid ourselves. The franchisees are in their system because they want to make a living and enjoy what they're doing. And if there's something going wrong and the franchisor is not prepared to address it at a council or in another way, then problems can emerge. Some of the typical things that franchisees want to speak to in most systems is marketing and advertising. They pay into funds. They're paying for that. The franchisor implements it, and they want to have some say. Often every franchisee thinks he or she has got a PhD in marketing, but that's not the point. The point is they're out there seeing the results of how their money is being spent. So it's really important that these types of issues get out in front. I saw one situation in a QSR franchise system where one of the senior franchisees who had been in there very early had a brilliant idea on a menu change, brought it up to the attention of the franchisor, and the franchisor said, "We don't care what you have to say about the menu. We're the food specialists." Not a smart thing when a guy is out there and has proven through his own results of how a menu change can be a financial benefit to everybody. That's the kind of thing you want the franchisees to bring forward and to discuss on your advertising council. And Travis, just before we do run out of time, I appreciate this is a topic that we're all experienced in and we love to talk about. I just want to raise a new idea that I had read about recently. Not a lot, but some franchise systems have established an ombudsman program for their own systems where the ombudsperson is independent and goes back and forth to try to deal with issues that might arise. Out of that ombuds program, there are a couple of franchisors that have established advisory councils that have thought that it may be of benefit to have an independent person be participating in the advisory council system and meetings, an independent, trusted person who can give some, it's almost like strategic planning, who can see that there may be an issue that is not getting the right attention or that should get more attention, or that there's a personality problem developing, and to give guidance to the council by being at those meetings and giving a level of independence and judgment to the operation. Something that I've read about some of the bigger systems in the US are doing that now, just so that the franchisees don't feel that they're going to get the we-they type of attitude that sometimes develops.
Right. That's That is a very interesting idea. I do like that. And, I think we're going to wrap it up here, guys, on, on just what you said last there, Frank, is, the we, they, or the us, them relationship at all costs. And everybody plays a part. Franchisee, franchisor, the employees at corporate, like everyone plays a part in making sure the relationship does not break down into the us versus them. And if FACs and the formation of an effective FAC or Franchise Advisory Council is a great way to do it. And I would encourage anyone listening to this, and particularly Canadian Franchise Association members, is reach out to Frank, reach out to Brian and Patrick. They all have some great advice on how to form these councils. But gang, wow, again, what an experienced group. We could probably even talk about FACs for another hour. We're gonna have to do another one on franchise advisory boards. But thank you guys so much for your time and sharing your insights and your knowledge.
And thanks to the CFA for making this available to everybody.
Right. Thank you to the CFA.
Thanks for listening. For more franchising resources, including how-to articles, expert advice, franchisee success stories, and franchise opportunities, visit franchisecanada.online. Don't forget to subscribe to Franchise Canada e-news while you're there. You can also learn more about franchising at cfa.ca and connect with specific franchise opportunities at lookforafranchise.ca.